Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our program, Sharing the Story, The Descendants of the Crypto Jews. I'm Linda Goff, President of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. Today's program features two wonderful people, Norma Libman and Isabelle Sandoval. They are the co-recipients of the 2021 Hurst Award, and that is an annual award given by the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society to an individuals or organization who has made a significant contribution to the research and understanding and knowledge of New Mexico Jewish history. And both Norma and Isabelle were co-recipients and well-deserved. So let me just give a couple of quick bio sketches of each of our speakers, and then I will hand it over directly to them. Norma Libman will be speaking first. Norma is a retired journalist from the Chicago Tribune, moved to New Mexico a little over 25 years ago, approximately. And for a long period of time has been very much involved in the research into crypto Jews, particularly here in New Mexico. And over the years has done a number of interviews with individuals and families and has spoken on this topic extensively throughout the country, and a very knowledgeable person, and also has other topics that she shares with different organizations. Isabelle Sandoval is a near native of New Mexico. She was born in Wyoming, but came to New Mexico at a relatively young age. And her family can trace its genealogical roots in the Southwest to almost 400 or 500 years ago. And Isabelle is a descendant of a Sephardic Jewish family. And among other things, Isabelle is a retired educational professional, having been a superintendent, school administrator, and teacher in New Mexico schools for a long, long time, and a very valuable member of our Jewish community here in New Mexico. And oh, by the way, she's a Denver Broncos fan. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Norma Libman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. That was very nice. I think I'm unmuted. So what we hope to be able to do today is to give you a perspective of how this story, this amazing story, has developed over the last 25 years or so. Of course, the story goes back way, way, way before that. And how it's been received by the public, and what we've encountered in teaching about it and doing research. So my involvement came totally by accident. It started in 1994. I knew nothing about this at all. I had never even heard of the term crypto Jew or Converso or anything in 1994. And I wrote an article for the Chicago Tribune that was published in May of 1994 about a subject that would seem to be extremely far removed from this one. It had to do with the secret writing system language among Chinese women. But amazingly enough, after the article was published, the paper and I began to get letters. There was an internet, but back in 1994, people wrote letters to the newspaper. And I got letters saying, well, one of the points about this was that it was a women's story. And people wrote and said, oh, there's been all kinds of other places in the world where women did important things like this and helped give an insight into the culture that male historians couldn't give, and so on. And then they would tell me places. harems, African tribes, all kinds of different places where women did some work that saved elements of the culture from being lost to history. And one of them was the crypto Jews. The way I first heard it was of New Mexico. Of course, doing research, I discovered that they had gone all over the world. I knew about the Inquisition, I knew when it was, but I didn't realize that there was such a movement of keeping the Jewish religion alive in secret. And did it fit in with this women's story idea? To a certain extent, it did, because so much of the religion, the Jewish religion, involves things that historically were the women's department: food, cleanliness, all of that. So I saw the connection, and I would, of course, being Jewish, I was really attracted to it. And I thought, how come I never knew about this? And I started to do research. And that was in 1994. I didn't move to New Mexico until 1996. I didn't move for that reason. It was already a plan. But I was in Chicago, and I was starting this research from there. And the first thing that I encountered was an article. I don't even remember where it was. I think probably in the Federation newspaper, about a poet in New Mexico named Isabelle Sandoval. And it told her story, and it included a poem that she wrote. And I thought, oh, well, this is where I'm going to start my research. And I contacted the writer of this article. I didn't know her, and I told her what I was wanting to do. And she said, well, she will never talk to you. So I love the story for two reasons. One, it turned out, of course, that she did talk to me, and we became friends. But also, it told me something that I hadn't gotten up until then, that this was very secret and very sensitive, and more important than I thought, more widespread than I thought. This was not just a little side story. This was a big deal, and it was very serious. And so that was a very important beginning to my research. The next most important beginning was when this was still before I moved to New Mexico, but I had the good fortune to find my way to Dr. Stanley Hordy's, and he was very, very helpful in also explaining to me the importance of the story, the importance of the secrecy. And I formulated two questions, which probably everybody comes to at one time or another through this. One, how did these people keep this secret for so long? And the second one was, why do they still keep the secret? And I know some answers to both of those questions, but it took a while to find out. So the research was slow. I thank Stan always for helping me know how to find people to talk to and how to conduct interviews, and how serious and sensitive the subject is. I would not have gotten anywhere without his help. I also was very lucky to fall into something that made me keep studying. And that is that when I moved here in June of 1996, by November of 1996, I was teaching for Elder Hostel, which is now called Rhodes Scholar. And I hope you've all heard of that. And they ran a program. When I first got involved, they were doing a 3-hour lecture in a week-long program with other subjects. Within a few years, it had become a week-long program once a month about the crypto-Jewish history. So it really grew quickly, and along with it, forced me to do research and not procrastinate or give up, as I sometimes do. And so I kept going, and I kept learning. And by doing this, I just to give you an example, and I'm assuming that most of this audience knows the story and the history. We're not really going into those details now, but I was teaching with a gentleman who was teaching what he called the history of the Jews in diaspora. He said he was teaching in this program, but he said he didn't really believe in the crypto-Jewish story. Over a matter of about 3 years, somewhat with my coming into the program with a new view of it, he discovered that he was a converso himself. And so he was teaching the program. This just to give you an idea of what this was like. He was teaching the program. He said, well, I know we're not conversos because, or I should say it a different way. I know this isn't real because my mother lit candles on Friday night and we're Catholic. So it just couldn't be. And it took about 3 years. So he was teaching the class part of it without even knowing that he was a converso. Once he really did his genealogical history and found out that he was, that's what changed the program, really. The fact that we actually had a converso in the teaching and we didn't know it. So as the years went on, more and more people, we talked to more and more people. We taught more and more people. People came from all over, not just all over the United States, but all over the world. We frequently had people from Canada, England, France, Israel, who came for this week-long program. Maybe they did other things as well, but while they were here, I'm sure, but they came for this week-long program and they were interested in it and already knew some history when they got here. And that's an important part of the story. So we moved on year by year, and the program grew, and the participants grew, and we were doing it almost once a month for a whole week. And people who came to the program were very taken by it, and they had open minds to begin with. They had come because they were interested in this story. And they would say to me, to both of us at the time, after a while, he retired and I went on teaching it for a long while after. But they would say, you have to come to our congregation and give a lecture, or to our federation, or whatever it was. And I went to California. I went several times, New York, different places several times, Illinois, Minnesota, Arizona, many, many places. And it was a very interesting phenomenon. When I got to those places, the reception was very, very different. The very enthusiastic elder hostel participant had gone back and thought that their congregation would be just as welcoming to this bit of Jewish history as they were, but that was never the case. At least not ever the case that the entire congregation embraced it. And often, many of them did not. They were sometimes close to openly hostile, not always, but sometimes pretty hostile. And the example that is the most stunning, so that's the one I'll give you. I was in one place. I'm not going to tell you what state, except it wasn't New Mexico. I'm not going to tell you what state. I'm not going to tell you what congregation or who the rabbi was. But sometimes I would be invited just to give a lecture, and sometimes it would be something like a weekend scholar in residence thing, and that's what this was. And I had spoken on Friday night for a short time. And I'd spoken in the Saturday morning service, and then I was to come back again Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning. So at the end of the Saturday morning portion, the all the participants and all the people who had just been there for services too, broke for lunch, and the rabbi came up to me and he said to me, and now he'd heard me speak twice, he said, you know, I don't believe a word you're saying. And I said, I was a little intimidating, but I said, well, maybe this afternoon after you hear I have some more things to say, maybe it'll start to fall in place for you. And he said to me, I'm not coming this afternoon, and walked away. So to me, that was the most extreme example of some of the hostility that I faced. So it was an interesting thing up here in New Mexico, and other parts of the Southwest, you know, in Texas, Southern Texas, in Arizona for sure, in California. Things were slowly opening up. People were getting more, were becoming more willing to talk about their own stories, and to invite me to speak to their relatives or their friends. You know, that one person told another person. And so it was all going very well. I thought, you know, things were getting more open, but in the rest of the country, it was not like that at all. Until maybe the last, in my experience, this is my experience, but I was in a lot of places. In my experience, it started to open up. Maybe about 10 years ago, I would say it was more, I was getting a little better, I was getting better responses in places other than New Mexico. And that was heartening to see that the story was making its way around to receptive audiences. And I understand where they all came from, because I went to Hebrew school for 4 years and the whole bit, but I never learned any of this. So it was, a very Ashkenazi history oriented history that I was taught. And I wasn't taught anything about Sephardic history. So I really knew nothing about it. So that was the way it went. It's sort of an arc, and it came to the top, I'd say, a few years ago. And now, of course, what we're seeing is a little bit different. With anti-Semitism growing worldwide, and for a number of other reasons, I think that there's a little bit of there's a backlash, and it's going the other way to a certain extent. I hope not too terribly much. But this is what Isabelle is going to address, what the current forces and politics and current events that are happening now in the past 4 or 5 years, particularly, how that has affected the community. So Isabelle, if you would.
Thank you, Norma. And I'm certainly glad that I gave you that interview some decades ago, and we have become good friends. You've really brought up some excellent points about anti-Semitism. And also, I think the most interesting topic goes to change. And Ron, if you would show that first slide I have on the presentation I have. And with that slide, I have the part about looking at changes. So looking at changes, I'm basically today going to speak about changes that I have observed since my childhood to now to 2022. I want to really look at the first point that I have, and that's gathering evidence and looking at facts. And as we look at gathering facts, I look at evidence and key groups, individuals, and organizations. And within the organizations, I would say within the key groups, family is important. How we look at genealogy is of essence. In my family, and I'm just kind of holding up a little book I have that's a journal that my family kept My mother would write journals, so I have this journal where she recorded a lot of information. I started off by hearing my grandfather give me information about our family, because my great-grandfather wrote a journal he started in 1891. Todo escrito en español. Everything was written in Spanish and more in New Mexico. And I was intrigued as a young girl of being 8 or 9 and wanted to know more about that information. Then my mother would give me information about recipes. And we keep the recipes in the family. And right now, what I do with my granddaughter, we research some of the recipes that we have always used within our family. For example, the tradition of making buñuelos for Christmas on Christmas Eve, which is also a Sephardic tradition for making bimuelos for Hanukkah. So some of those traditions we didn't know until we started researching. As an educator, I was also interested in looking at the Spanish. So one of the books that I've looked at was written by Rubén Cobos, and he talks about the Spanish of New Mexico, which is very, very unique. Another thing we did within the family unit was tell stories, and telling the stories was essential to conveying information. And there's a lot of research within the information about families. And this book is really very insightful about keeping the cuentos that go back to Spain that were used by my grandpa, by my tios, and we would use these stories on evenings to talk about. And also as an educator, to me, I like the part about looking at language, syntax, phonology, morphemes, and looking at the atlas of New Mexico and southern Colorado. So these pieces of information help me as I looked at who am I and how do I look at my identity. Then later, I looked at some of the research that has come about, and my first inkling looking at research happened in 1973 when I purchased a book, which I didn't have the money to buy, and it's The Origin of New Mexico Families by Angelico Chavez. And this is a classic book that gives the origin of the families in New Mexico. This book is really essential. Then in about 1992, I heard Stan Hortus speak. So this was like 20 some years later. And afterwards I heard him speak, and I purchased his book. If you do not have this book, this is really crucial to understanding the research of New Mexico. And I think Dr. Hortus brings about the importance of looking at Portuguese influence and ancestry in Mexico and New Mexico. So this book was also good for looking at the research. Another New Mexican researcher is Jose Esquivel, and you can note the length of some of the books that I'm sharing, because a lot of profound genealogical information has been recorded by many different researchers pertaining to New Mexico. And then we've had Seth Cunin, who wrote about looking at identities. And to me, those have been really important books to look at, besides looking outside of the family unit. Another group I think is very important are the rabbis. And years ago, I had the fortune of meeting Rabbi Mark Angel. On his own, Rabbi Angel sent me a book, and we have corresponded throughout the years. And my point is that he did not try to convert me, but I really appreciate having a rabbi reach out and share other materials with me. So I found the connection with Rabbi Angel to be very heartwarming. Then we started about 2000 looking at DNA. What is ancestry? What is the ethnic composition of persons? And you have to know that in New Mexico at that time, here it was like a lot of Hispanics were saying, I'm not Jewish, I'm 100% Catholic, and people were offended. I know in my own family, there were family members who were upset with me by saying we had Jewish roots. Well, then the DNA came out, and lo and behold, many of us had markers that showed our Jewish ethnicity. So to me, it's important to look at the research within that. And then we have also the part about organizations, how important organizations are. For example, the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, the conferences that are put on, the updates that we have, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, how important it is to have the conferences and what we have for research. However, my last point is that we have a need for updated research, and that we have some of the research, but how do we triangulate some of the DNA with the historical information? How do we connect Mexico to New Mexico, Cuba, whatever it is, how are we able to make these connections? And the next slide goes on to look at what I call the societal impact regarding technology. So as we look at technology, we know just within the last 20 years, the impact of technology, how has the internet, social media impacted us? There's less face-to-face time, family time. What I've noticed is less Spanish is spoken. For example, I live in Santa Fe, but now I don't go as often to visit my relatives in northern New Mexico or southern New Mexico, simply because it's easier to connect on the internet. And this also demonstrates a loss of Spanish spoken. We do have increased global connections, but at the same time, I lament the lack of the quality of links for crypto Jews, wherever they may be, the descendants of people, because sometimes some of the links that are out there are written by other people and they're very good, but yet they're not meeting the needs of looking at the identity of descendants of crypto Jews. The next slide looks at the part about listening to the voices of descendants of crypto Jews. And when I think about this, I think of the Shema, Oye Israel, the Lord our God is one. Oh, hear Israel. So listening is very important. How do we listen to different regional voices, not just within northern New Mexico or southern New Mexico? Many New Mexicans went to California, to Colorado. How do we incorporate this large family? How do we enlist the help of speakers and authors? And how do we create scholarship opportunities for young people interested in pursuing this field? And how do we provide for the publication of creating this voice? On the left hand side of the screen, you can see the shield of the Sandoval, my dad's family crest. And this also applied to me because I was so interested in my mother's family history, because I had the little journals to go along, taking me back to about 1720, that I neglected to listen to my father's story. And I lost my dad about 8 years ago, but I had about 20 prime years of interviewing my father and listening to my dad as he told me the stories. And all I can say is I am astounded as to what all he shared with me. And within that listening part, I found out that his mother, who was a staunch Catholic, celebrated the Feast of Esther in Las Vegas, New Mexico. So it shows how that listening to different voices is so important within the family. And the next slide, I look at the part of the challenges brought about by the pandemic and the Iberian returns. And to me, it's important to think about the pandemic. I think all of us have learned isolation. We've learned the importance of family, of health, just all the things that really mean the most to us. But it's been an arduous 2 years. Within that time period, about 2015, we also had the Iberian returns. And I know I studied looking at the returns between Spain and looking at Portugal. And for me, I didn't feel comfortable with the Spanish return, although I think it was a wonderful opportunity. But I was interested in the return because to me, it was like if I spoke to a rabbi or I did something, it was like, you can take this one pathway, but you can't take this other pathway. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to make the return to the Iberian Peninsula? So what I did as I studied these two venues, I finally looked at Portugal. And by the way, the Spanish return has been closed. So it is no longer open. And the Portuguese return on March the 18th was closed in Porto. There were 2 places in Portugal that were open for the return. One return was in Porto, and that designation was determined by the rabbi of the Porto synagogue or community, and that changed. And also on March the 18th, Lisbon is the only open avenue now for Portuguese dual citizenship, but that is also changing. Lisbon based their citizenship on genealogy, which was different than Porto, and on March 18th has changed the premise of looking at the dual citizenship by one, having ownership of inherited land in Portugal, and 2, by making frequent trips. And so those whole things have changed. And looking at Portugal, some of the information that has come about has been that there are 3 countries who really comprise the most returnees, that being Israel, Turkey, and Morocco. And New Mexico is only a sliver, a tiny little piece of that pie that is inclusive within that return. My point of this is that the Spanish and the Portuguese returns are determined by basically national entities, sovereign entities. They determine who makes the return to their countries, and they will eventually, make their own reports. I chose the Lisbon return. And so 3 years ago, I received my passport from Portugal. So I have my passport, but it was very personal for me because I had to make the choice, and it was an individual choice. Why did I make this choice? I looked at the choice, one, because I wanted to honor my mother and my father. So it was important to honor my descendants and my ancestors for making the return to Portugal. So that was important to me. Secondly, when I made the return, everybody else was making the return to Spain. I think I was one of the first persons to look at Portugal, but I liked the requirements of Portugal. And so I went through the Lisbon synagogue, and looking at the Lisbon synagogue, what I did, I had to start with myself, and I worked backwards with my genealogy. So I would work all the way backwards to determining what my genealogy was. I didn't enlist the help of anyone. I've been doing genealogy for years, but I have to admit that when I did this process, it took me about 6 months of solid research, and it was like writing another dissertation just to write this piece for the requirement. So it was interesting to be able to do that and to make that return as such like that. When I think of the returns, my last point on this slide looks at the similarities of the exile and the Iberian returns. And looking at the exile and the Iberian returns, I think back to 1492 in Spain. And I think right now, having lived through the pandemic, what would have I done had I been given 3 months to make up my mind to leave Spain? We know many, many families suffered and they did that. And in 3 months, they sold what they had, they left, they made choices. But now living through the pandemic, I'm beginning to understand how people tarried, how they waited, how they hoped there would be another escape for them, because maybe they had a sick mother or father, maybe they couldn't sell their business, maybe their spouse was a new Christian, and other people fled to Portugal, where they basically tried to wait out the Inquisition until history changed on them within Portugal. But to me, the similarities of the exile and the Iberian returns have been profound throughout the last several years. The last slide I have really just says, gracias for sharing the perspectives of descendants of crypto-Jews shaping New Mexico. The New Mexico Jewish Historical Society has been great in looking at this as a mission statement. Within this, I really have 3 points that I think about to end my talk. One of the first things I would say would be that I am so sorry for all the persons who really attempted to go through either the Spanish or the Portuguese returns, and for whatever reasons that avenue was halted for them. It was very discouraging for people to pay the money they did, and just the emotional trauma of having to undergo that was profound. Secondly, I would say that what I've learned in this process, that in New Mexico, I found that I was just shocked to learn about the Portuguese contributions. So that would be one aspect I would really like to look at, would be how do we include this in better coverage for what we have in understanding within history. And lastly, my last point is that I have a hope, and a hope that will change all of us and our communities, my children, people who are wherever they are, and that's to look at further research of identity of New Mexico crypto-Jews, not just within New Mexico, but to bond, to really look at targeted research that could we not share with other collaborative efforts with other organizations or groups. Let's say that maybe we look at having a joint effort between something with New Mexico and El Paso, Texas. Instead of looking at a big target of Sephardic Jews, what about looking at something that would be more at a smaller pace, and that way we could connect together and look at making some research, maybe triangulating data that would also be with DNA, some family history, other things like that. But there is a hope, and I have seen the changes, and I am really very happy that I am where I am today, and that I know who I am. And thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, and Norma. If people have other questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and I will be happy to try to facilitate that. There is a hand up with Janet Rickles, I believe. So if you would kindly unmute and ask your question or make your comment.
Sure. I wondered about whether or not there was any idea of numbers of families in New Mexico who perhaps have crypto Jewish roots.
May I,
Oh, do you go ahead, Isabel?
I believe the 2015 New Mexico Jewish Federation survey, within the survey for Jews in New Mexico, accounted for about 5% of total Jews in New Mexico, delineated that they had crypto-Jewish heritage. I don't remember the numbers as such, but I do know that it was 5%. And so I don't know the percentage of that, but I can tell you that within the changes that I have seen since about 1990 to now, with the research that's come about, some of my own family members who were entirely Catholic now openly acknowledge, their Jewish roots.
Thank you.
Norma, did you want to add to Isabel's comments?
Oh, well, I just wanted to say that it's very hard to get an actual number for something like this. Exactly what Isabel was saying, that you can't just ask people. If they say no, you don't know if that's correct or not. They don't really need to answer that question for anybody. So it's impossible, but historians believe that approximately 40% of the original Spanish settlers in New Mexico had some Jewish connection, whether they knew it or not. So if you look at that, you could see that the number could be pretty high, but it's just impossible to pin down. And I think that Isabel's percentage is probably right on.
Thank you. There's a question and comment for you, Norma. The gentleman says, I don't quite understand why the rabbi and others disrespected your presentation. Can you explain, please?
You want me to explain why he disrespected me?
Or your perception of
Yeah,
what?
well, I gave that example because it was the most egregious of anyone that I encountered, but I wanted you to see the extent it could come to. There is an element of resistance on the part of Ashkenazi Jews that they don't believe that this is real, because they don't believe, they haven't learned the Sephardic history. I understand that because that's where I was. And they look upon, and this is a generalization, but many look upon this as some movement to, I actually heard the term used at one time, jump on the Jewish bandwagon. Now, I didn't know there was a Jewish bandwagon. I'm still not familiar with it, but it's sort of a sense. I will tell you another story about a person who returned to Judaism after discovering his Converso history, and decided to return, studied, and was at the point of having his bar mitzvah. And again, I'm not using anybody's names. I never do for anything. he was on the Friday night before of his bar mitzvah weekend. He was in the synagogue, and a member of the congregation came up to him, and it had been announced that in the Saturday morning he would have become a bar mitzvah. A member of the congregation came up to him and said, "You did this the easy way." Now that's ludicrous. But I think I think there's a misunderstanding without the education, without a full education of the history and just what Isabelle mentioned, that imagine having to uproot your family, having to sell everything that you have. There's this in my generation, when I was a kid, none of this was taught to us. And so I think it's just a resistance of saying, well, you're trying to get in on something now that you weren't part of. To my mind, after all the people I've talked to, it's the other way around. It's been very easy for many Ashkenazi Jews to be Jewish, whereas many conversos and crypto Jews have come down from a family history where it's been next to impossible to be Jewish. So I don't know if that helps, but I would consider him to be part of that group who's coming from that mindset. Now, I think he was also rude to me, and I can't answer why that was the case, but that I would say was the mindset he was coming from.
Isabelle, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that's why I included the portion of Rabbi Mark Angel, because I wanted to be positive and to say how uplifting it was that he shared a book with me, he wrote little notes, and we have communicated throughout the years. And again, it was never anything that was like, I'm trying to convert you, or I want you to think this way. It was simply, here's more information for you. And I just think that positivity goes a long way.
Yeah, and if I could say one other thing, to me, it's heartbreaking to think that somebody at this time could discover this history and go to a lot of work to discover it and really make sure that you got it right. And then to be rejected, as they sometimes are, by what we would call mainstream Judaism. That isn't even a fair term. But after 500 years, to hit a wall again, and that it's Jewish people who are creating the difficulties. This isn't universal, but it happens a lot.
Thank you both. One of our participants has asked if either one or both of you could do a very quick overview of the returns. She is not familiar with what that is about. So if you could just briefly address that, whichever would like to go first.
Well, I think, I'm sure Isabelle can, if she wants to, talk from personal experience, but I can just say that the word return, and Isabelle, correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that by and large, the idea of having to convert to Judaism for a person who has a family Jewish history going back 500 years and knows it is offensive in a way. They were forced to convert. Their ancestors were forced to convert, and so rather than use the term convert, they prefer the term return. Although they would study. If they have not education, they would study as if it were for a conversion, if you will, but it would be a return. Would that be right, Isabelle?
I think you voiced that very appropriately. And I would say, from my own perspective, that's the reason I made the Portuguese return, because to me, it was being able to go back and to validate. And I really did that because, like I said, to honor my family, but it was also the part that my son could say, my mother is a Jewish Sephardita Georgian Portuguesa. So that was important to me, that he would be able to say, yes, I have a Portuguese Jewish mother, which is halakhic.
And let's, there's, I just, when I hear you talking, I realize something. We need to be careful about the word return because it's being used in two different ways. One is
Right.
this, to return to Spain or Portugal, Iberian return, what have you, or to return to Judaism, which might not necessarily involve regaining Iberian citizenship. It might be just returning to the Jewish religion without involving that other part of it. So that word return it has now taken on a double meaning. So
That's a very important distinction. And thank you, Norma, for raising that. Felicia Anchor has her hand up. So Felicia, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for really a sophisticated conversation about the implications of all of this. Mine's not quite as sophisticated, but it's sparked by Isabelle. You're talking about the future. I'm just wondering, within the Catholic community of New Mexico, if this has raised any tickles of consideration. If you and your colleagues ever approached by any of the churches or any of the organized Catholic groups to provide opportunities for those of the Catholic faith to dig a little deeper into their heritage?
That's an excellent question. I think it's really changed though within the last 20 years. As I mentioned during my presentation, prior to looking at some of the DNA, most New Mexicans, basically would say, I am not Jewish. And once the DNA came out, I've seen an acceptance come about community-wise with people who now acknowledge that they do have a Jewish ethnic background. As far as it goes with other organizations, I really haven't been approached by anyone like that, but I think it's kind of more of an acceptance that we have, that we know that it is there. And I honestly believe the pandemic has really altered a lot of societal, I guess, just our exchange over the last 2 years. And I think it's a very wonderful opportunity for all of us to embrace each other as human beings, regardless of what our background is.
Norma, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
no, as a not being Converso myself, since I'm Ashkenazi, I did not get, I wouldn't have gotten approached with a question like that. So that is both bailiwick.
Equal opportunity. Wanted to give you a chance, Norma. One of our attendees did mention that about 5-6 years ago, there was a survey done here in New Mexico of those who self-identified as members of the Jewish community, regardless of heritage background. And that number was approximately 24,000, if that helps fill in some gaps for some folks. There's a question here, is there interest among crypto Jews in returning to Judaism?
Well, yes, but not as much as you would think. That's what my feeling is, that not as much as I would have thought. There is some interest. Sometimes they are rebuffed and discouraged easily, so it doesn't go anywhere. Some people very fervently do want to return to Judaism, but I think most people that I've encountered will say something along the lines that I guess we were Jewish whenever, but I'm not Jewish now, and they're very fine with that. I don't know. I think Isabelle has access to more information or more people than I do, so I don't know.
I think there is an interest. I would also say that as an educator, I believe in education. So within education, what opportunities have been presented to Hispanics in the community? And that's why I say that it would be nice to offer some writing contests, some scholarships, other venues for persons to be involved in so that they can understand, you know, that important piece of identity and also historical contributions to New Mexico. As an educator, I would say that I'm actually very saddened that this is one area I don't see taught. And I think it's like Norma highlighted earlier, that we're really living in a time where it's almost like, is it acceptable to even discuss a topic of religion within education as such, or schools when we look at standards and values? And I think this would be something that we have to look at, but I still believe education is a key for opening up doors and having people become knowledgeable in the area of what is crypto-Judaism, what is Judaism, and what is it to be a person who gives and cares and respects others within the community.
Thank you. Another question in the chat box: why is crypto still so secretive among individuals and families?
Well, I think part of it is just a heritage that people they've been taught for generations that this is the family secret. And of the people that I know who maintain the secret, it is more to honor that family secret than it is out of a fear of being discovered to be Jewish. And it is very much, I think Isabelle would agree with this, a family issue. I mean, if I say, if I'm in a Catholic family and I say, you know what, here's the truth, I'm Jewish, then my sisters and brothers are Jewish, my parents are Jewish, and maybe they don't want to be. So it's very hard to be, you have to be very brave to be able to say this. And you also have to be willing to offend family members, which I don't think most people want to do, would you know, so, and I think it's just become a part of their life that this is our family secret for many people.
I think that's a very complex question. And to me, it's like, I think in my own family, where I've actually been banned from attending certain activities simply because of my beliefs. And then I think of my one of my closest relatives, my sister, who called herself a Sephardic Catholic. And she was Catholic, but yet she studied, she recognized the Jewish practices. And I thought it was so interesting that she, you know, designated herself as quasi, you know, Jewish within that. And then I think the other piece within that is, it's not the part of just the secrecy, but I think the secrecy has been cloaked in almost a forgotten past. So within that forgotten past, it's like when I started looking at, why did my aunt make buñuelos at Christmas time? And I started looking at some of the historical documentation. Then to me, it was like opening up another book, another chapter, and looking at, well, why was it just this time of the year? And then looking at, well, these are the buñuelos made by the Sephardic people from Iberia. So in a way, it's almost like a forgotten part that needs to be kindled again.
Thank you. Cheryl Aronson, you had your hand raised. Would you be kind enough to share your question and or comment with us?
As I actually had a comment and a question. I live in Ohio, and I have a number of friends who have converted, who have said that they feel like they were Jewish in another life. And I found that very interesting, that they kind of like the opposite of what these crypto Jews are saying, that they're feeling like they are Jewish, despite the fact that most of them haven't had the experience of family lighting candles or family doing things that they grew up in that were Jewish rituals. They just feel like they've got a Jewish soul that led them to want to convert to Judaism. The question I have is, I know that there's a lot of DNA tests out there that people can do on their own to just find out their ancestry. But other than doing that just out of curiosity, just in general, to find out about yourself, you say a lot of people who find out a lot of people in New Mexico are saying that no, we're not Jewish, we're Catholic. There's no Jews in my family, but then they're surprised when they find out they are. What would lead them to get tested if they don't believe that they're Jewish?
Well, I think people test just out of curiosity. It's not just for the fact that they're looking for the Jewish part, but they want to know, their background. So that to me is like of importance to people, why do they test? And then many people here do test, and they have, they have the Jewish roots, and I think it's just a matter of curiosity that people want to be able to know who they are. And it is interesting, and there are different types of DNA testing. And I think it's really important to recognize that when one takes a DNA test, it's also an estimation of what your background is. It isn't concrete saying this is what you are, your composition, but it's an estimation dependent on the algorithm of what the testing company has. But yet that genetic code is recorded across many of these testing companies.
Yeah, because I did the I think it was like 23andMe, I think it's called, something like that. And it came back that I'm like 98% Ashkenazi Jewish. So, but that was as I expected. So.
Thank you. We'll take just one or two more questions before we need to adjourn, but we will be able to keep these questions and comments so that perhaps later on either Isabelle or Norma would be kind enough to respond to those. So let me just bring up one or two more, if I may. Can one of the panelists share their perspective about why there are doubts within Spain and I believe the current government of Spain and the Ministry of Justice about the legitimacy of New Mexico's Sephardic Jews? If there isn't solid documentation to prove our Sephardic history of New Mexico. So I guess please go ahead.
I think that is a valid question. And when we look at the returns, it's not just Spain, but Portugal has also decided, looking at certain families. There are certain families in Portugal, from Portugal and Spain authorities who designate that they don't consider certain families to be valid Sephardic families. And that's one of the reasons I propose it would be wonderful to have collaboration with some other organizations so that we could do some more research and hopefully able to open up doors that would, answer these questions. But to be perfectly honest, we also know that when you look at some of the genealogies in the past, starting from the exile in 1492, were falsified. So how many of these genealogies were true? And then secondly, we look at, besides the genealogies that are out there, we have to look at how many records were also lost and destroyed. We know many of the records were lost and destroyed. So that's why I ask for or advocate that it is imperative that we have some collaboration. So because I believe that the governments have actually addressed some issues out there that need to be answered. And I think it's incumbent on us to be able to say, this really serves as a turning point for us to be asking these questions and to look for more research.
Norma, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Isabella has said it exactly right.
Okay. So one last question. So if a woman has, quote, returned to Judaism, are her children automatically considered Jewish by the rabbinate, or do they also have to return?
Well, one thing I would say about that, Isabel may have a better answer. I don't know. First of all, we don't have a pope. Pretty much different rabbis say different things. So I don't think there's one possible answer to that. That's a really interesting question, and I've never heard it asked. So, but my guess would be that there isn't one answer to that. I don't know. Isabel, what do you think?
I really like that question because that's one of the questions I look at often. I think it depends on the type of Judaism you're looking at. So are you looking at orthodoxy, or are you looking at something that's more reformed? So as you look at that, because I know some years ago, I went through a return, but I know it would not be considered valid in Israel by some of the rabbis. So that's one of the reasons I looked at the Portuguese return. But again, I come back to looking at, who is a Jew? And that's what it all comes down to. Who is a Jew? And I believe the way we live our lives daily and how we treat other people exemplifies what Judaism really means.
Actually, I'm going to sneak one last question. what about those crypto Jews who never left Spain? Good question.
Mhm. It is. They're still there. There are still Jews in Spain. Lots of them. Yeah, that's an enormous, there's an awful lot that has to be said about that. So I don't think, but it's certainly, there are many Jews that stayed in Spain, converted and remained Jewish in secret. And I'm sure if they could carry it out 500 years in New Spain, they could carry it out 500 years in Spain too. I really believe that, but that's just my belief. I can't document it.
Isabelle, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Norma pretty well said, or expressed my sentiments. And I would add to that, that it is really regarding identity, and it's what a person chooses. So I think within that, it has to be a matter of a choice that a person makes to say, this is the type of life I want, whether I do it hidden or whether I do it openly.
Okay. Well, there are many comments thanking both of you for your talks and personalizing so much of your experiences, stories, and research. And so a round of applause to both of you. Some people have asked for links to the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, and our organization, we're going to be putting out an email thanking everyone for coming today. So we'll be sure to include that as well. And so we thank you both very much, and everyone who tuned in today. And have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.